Hey there, Professor Zeeb here. Welcome into our audiovisual lecture. This time we're going to be talking about self-esteem, and we're going to look at some classic research involving that. You know, self-esteem is one of those things that really takes off during the elementary school years, so it's an important concept to kind of master. And unfortunately, low self-esteem, we've discovered, is linked with some pretty negative outcomes and some problems. So it's obviously well worth the time in a class like this to kind of go over those concepts. All right. So remember, when we're talking self-esteem, what we mean by that is sort of a global evaluation of the self. Excuse me, a global evaluation of the self, where the child is really evaluating who they are as a person. Okay. So in other words, their value and their worth, they're sort of judging what that is. And so we want, you know, in a way, in a sense, it's kind of like your overall feelings of yourself. So it's important for kids to understand that they do have strengths and abilities and not to focus on the negative. But we're going to look at some research in how that's related to competence and some different problems. So let's take a look here. Okay, so let's take a look at some self-esteem research here. Number one, self-esteem in children is often influenced by parental interaction, which makes sense. So if we have parents that are consistently thrashing on their kids and they're not focusing on the positive, we see that trickling down to the child's evaluation of themselves. So once again, so important what you say around your children and how you treat them and so forth. Unfortunately, self-esteem does not always match reality. So you have to kind of keep that in mind, that a child may have an artificially inflated self-esteem where they think everything is great and they have these positive attributes, but in reality, it's not quite the case, or even vice versa. So we're finding that children during this time, especially when they're younger, those self-esteem factors don't always quite match up to what's actually happening in the reality or the real world, if you would. Unfortunately, low self-esteem is linked with many, many different problems. We're just going to kind of list them off here. So low self-esteem is linked with obesity. You know, I think that could probably go a couple different ways, because depression and low self-esteem could certainly lead to obesity. Maybe this is the way they cope with their depression, but certainly being obese could lead to those lower feelings about themselves. So I think, to me, that's a two-way street. That's definitely a correlational factor there. We know that low self-esteem is associated with anxiety, unfortunately. Depression, as we've mentioned. Unfortunately, suicide. So there's, you know, a really heavy-duty kind of negative consequence of low self-esteemers. We know that low self-esteemers are more likely to abuse substances, which carry all kinds of problems, including health risks, psychological problems, and many more. We also know that people who are delinquent are more than likely to have a lower self-esteem. So once again, there's a connection there to feeling horrible about yourself and not evaluating yourself in a positive way, to children that get into trouble and do some of these delinquent acts that we see. All right, so now we're going to look at how self-esteem is related to competence, and we're going to look at a very landmark study by Susan Harder. This one goes back to 1999. And in this particular study, she analyzed children ages 8 to 13 in this particular study, and she asked them about their self-esteem. Through her research, she discovered 5 critical areas that seem to be important to self-esteem and therefore competence. Okay. Now remember, as we go through these, we're looking through the eyes of a child. As an adult, we would not necessarily focus on these things specifically. I mean, certainly could be focused on, but remember, we're looking through an elementary school age child. So one of the things that kids focus on, according to Harder, are the scholastic ability. In other words, how they're doing in school, their grades. That seemed to be a critical factor. Athletic skills. You know, once again, this is, you know, kind of showing how children view the world very differently. So are they good at sports? Do they do well in PE? That kind of thing. A lot of kids reported that their athletic ability really translated into feeling good or bad about themselves. Likability by peers. So do they have friends? Are they accepted? Are they isolated? Those types of things obviously would factor into how a child feels about themselves. Physical appearance. So once again, kids really focus on how they look, especially in the later years of elementary school. So wearing the right clothes, being good looking. Obviously, and as an adult, that's important, but that doesn't make me a good or bad person. That shouldn't influence how I sort of feel about myself because there's so many dimensions to consider. But children seem to kind of focus on those physical attributes. All right, and then lastly, behavioral conduct. In other words, are they getting in trouble? Are they following the rules? That kind of thing. That seems to be a critical, important factor in terms of competence of young children. All right, so continuing on with the study here, Harder found that children feel they do not do well in all 5 types. So even though on average, we find that these 5 areas seem to be pretty important, she found that children feel they do not do well in all 5 types. In other words, if we rated each one of those in the child's estimation of themselves, we would not find a consistent factor necessarily. In other words, if we graph that, we would find it sort of a sawtooth sort of pattern where a child may feel really good about their scholastic ability, but not so hot in likability by peers. In other words, it was pretty rare to have a child that says, wow, I do well in every single area, or I am poor in every single area. In other words, there was a lot of variability found in those findings. Each child was given a profile where they would rate each of these 5 types in the study, and she found extreme variability in those findings. She also noticed, and so this part's kind of confusing, but some children who had different profiles had similar levels of self-esteem. And some children who had similar profiles had different levels of self-esteem. In other words, there was a lot of variability. In other words, even though children may have the exact same profile, they may feel very, very differently about themselves. So let me just repeat that, it's worth repeating. Some children who had different profiles had similar levels of self-esteem, and some children who had similar profiles had different levels of self-esteem. So I want you to think about how would you sort of interpret that? What this basically means is that self-esteem, in some cases, is affected by what areas children perceive to be important. Even though we know these 5 areas that we've mentioned are critical to competence and self-esteem, children seem to focus on one and may not the other necessarily in the same way. So for example, if a child felt really strongly about school and they performed well in school, they probably felt good about themselves. But if they performed well in school, but they didn't really focus on that, that may not have been a critical factor as, say, physical ability or physical appearance, where they sort of invest more of their concentration and feeling into that area. So it turns out whatever area the child feels is most important to themselves, that seemed to be the critical factor in terms of what their self-esteem and thus their competence was. Okay? Harder also found that receiving support from important people in their lives seemed to be very important. In other words, as you would imagine, kids need that structure. They need that support and feedback from people. And so let's say they're having a horrible day and they're feeling bad about themselves. It was really helpful to have a parent say, hey, you know what? I know you're having a bad day. Maybe this wasn't the greatest thing for you, but you have all these other great areas. You can improve. I know you can get better. Let's try it again, that kind of thing. So in other words, kids who have high self-esteem typically have someone who supports them. Obviously, it's going to be mom or dad in most cases, but not necessarily. Kids need that support. They need that sort of reassurance from an adult figure, in my opinion. And that, according to this research, they found that it seemed to be pretty important to the child's feelings of themselves. So very important to provide that support. So the study showed kids who received little support in their lives had the lowest self-esteem in the study. And kids that had the most support were the ones that probably felt the best about themselves. So overall, they found that pattern, and it shows how important that support actually is. In other words, self-esteem is not necessarily internally derived. Even though it kind of seems that way, sometimes outside sources contribute to that, as we've mentioned earlier. So we said those 5 areas were very important to competence and self-esteem, okay? So let's just mention those again. So scholastic ability, athletics, likability by peers, physical appearance, and behavioral conduct seem to be the 5 critical factors. However, if we had to pick one that seemed to be the most influential in terms of their self-esteem, it was physical appearance. So physical appearance was the leading predictor of self-esteem according to this study. In other words, those who thought their looks determined their self-esteem felt worse about their performance, or their appearance, excuse me, and had lower self-esteem and were more subject to depression. So in other words, even though these 5 areas are critical, this is the one that kids seem to really focus on. What they look like, are they wearing the appropriate clothes, their hairstyle, all those different things that go with how you look as a person seem to be almost magnified during this time. Now, as an adult, that is important. We understand that, but certainly that is not everything in terms of who we are as a person. It's interesting how children really focus on this one compared to the other areas that we mentioned. A lot of psychologists believe that the reason this is because it's influenced by the media. The media, through technology and pop culture and things like that, really communicate this message to our kids that appearance is everything. You have to look your best to feel your best. And certainly that does matter to a certain extent, but that is not everything. So it's interesting how our society really focuses on looking younger and looking the best you can be, when obviously that's not everything to who you are as a person. Susan Harder also found some differences between what we call the high self-esteemers, the kids who felt really good about themselves, and the low self-esteemers, the ones that felt pretty rotten about their self-esteem. Here's what she found. Low self-esteemers believe their looks and opinions of others actually determine their self-esteem. So in other words, their looks seem to be sort of related to how people feel about them and what they tell them. Whereas the high self-esteemers, a whole different sort of ballgame and story here. High self-esteemers believe their sense of self caused others to think highly of them, and felt their sense of self-esteem led to feelings of competency. Do you guys see the difference there? A huge, huge difference between those 2 groups. What that boils down to is a big difference between those 2 groups, is that it shows that children who feel bad about themselves, the ones that have low self-esteem, seem to feel almost out of control when it comes to these issues, where the high self-esteemers, the ones that feel great about themselves, seem to have a more internal perspective when it comes to self-esteem, which actually causes changes in others. Do you guys see that difference? In other words, kids who generally feel bad about themselves almost feel like they can do nothing to get out of it. They feel like they're not in control, they're along for the ride. This is determined for them. Where the high self-esteemers, sort of the general finding is that they felt they're in the driver's seat. They're controlling their destiny in terms of self-esteem, and that causes changes in other people. So wow, a big difference between those 2 groups. So to me, the message there is let children know that you are in control of this. Even though there's certain things you can't control, how you feel about yourself is an internal thing, and you have to control your own destiny in that particular realm. So that's a big, important message. All right, so what I want to do next is just kind of wrap this up with some recommendations to kind of think about as we ponder the concept of self-esteem here. It's very important to provide honest evaluation of children. So you don't want to lie to them. You don't want to be deceptive about them. However, you want to couple that with support and encouragement. So let's say your child came home from school and they failed an exam. They're really into school. They're sort of focused on that, and they feel horrible, and thus their self-esteem is plummeting. What the experts are recommending there is that you should say something like, wow, yeah, maybe you're not so hot in this particular area of school. I'm sorry that you failed this exam, but you know what? With a little work and some discipline, we can improve this. I'm here for you. I know you can do it. Let's try it again. Let's try to fix this problem because I know you can become better. In other words, we're giving them this sort of positive outlook, even though it seems sort of sugar-coated in that way. You don't want to focus on the negative necessarily. You want to be honest, but at the same time, give them that glimmer of hope that things can actually improve, and they will if you put your mind to it. Remember, the high self-esteemers are the ones that really believe internal factors play into this. So the point is that you should praise them, but at the same time, be honest in their failures, but give them that support and encouragement that they actually need to grow as a person and to feel good about themselves. Because as we mentioned, self-esteem, low self-esteem is really linked to a lot of hardcore type problems, as we mentioned early on. All right, guys, so hopefully that makes sense to you. Hopefully you found this meaningful to you and you can use this with your own children. I'm really going to recommend looking at this research because it is really good stuff and there's some powerful messages embedded in there. All right, so thanks for listening, guys. I hope you're enjoying the class and we will see you online.